I'm a diversity, equity, inclusion major. I do appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
First question I have, I do appreciate you not completely denying the existence of systemic racism, but just want you to follow me for 30 seconds here. Obviously, everyone can admit that slavery and Jim Crow is wrong, especially by today's standards. But then my question is, I believe that as a result of that, that's why we still see a problem in today's society. Slavery happened for 400 years, 13 Amendments passed, slavery ended, then until 1964, that's when the Second Civil Rights Act passed, and that's when everyone was considered both separate and equal. I was born in 2000, I just turned 22. I was born in one of the most diverse cities in the world, and I'm not using this as an anecdote at all.
Sure.
But when I was born, there was no multiracial option on my birth certificate. I was either white or black. So that was only 22 years ago, and to me, that's a problem, that it's denying the existence of a certain demographic. So my question is, do you believe that there's still a problem today? Because I did bring statistics if you question me back, but do you believe there's still a problem today as a result of systemic racism from over 400 years ago?
So yeah, it'd be an interesting thing to try to break down. So you certainly have people that are Black Americans who experienced Jim Crow and experienced the oppression of going through Jim Crow and then had children. So that carries down to generation. I think there's absolutely no denying that. I would be interested to hear a conservative argument that would try to debunk that in any way, because that's just fact. The issue becomes, what do you do for people who are members of these families, and how do you gauge the amount of harm or maybe a financial burden that was created by their families growing up in that time? I think that becomes particularly difficult. And it seems as though the woke ideologues, as far as critical race theory, have decided that we make up for past discrimination with present discrimination, which is what I am against. But I think there's no denying that there would be remnants of the racist problems of Jim Crow carrying out through families. The issue becomes, how do you solve it? And I think a lot of people misjudge maybe the scope of that harm and blame a lot of problems that are happening within the Black community now on being remnants of Jim Crow. Like, you'll hear a lot of people say, well, the reason that Black fathers aren't in the household is because of Jim Crow and because of slavery, or the reason that Black people are of lower socioeconomic status is because of Jim Crow and because of slavery. And I deny those claims just because we did go through periods of just epic financial growth within the Black community through Jim Crow. So actually, while they were experiencing legalized discrimination and systemic racism, we saw amazing growth in the Black family, and we had Black children growing up in nuclear families, rates of which we've never seen in the modern age. So how much of the harm do we subscribe to Jim Crow? How much do we subscribe to Black culture? That becomes the question. I'd argue more of the harm lies in Black culture, and if you can find harm in Jim Crow, how do you repair that? Yeah, I guess that's where I land, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Over here.
How do you feel about Black women and other minority women and the death rate of birthing babies, and why it is 2.9 times higher than white women?
Sure. This is often an argument that is brought up when it comes to systemic racism in America, and I'll lay it out for you all. Black women are more likely to die giving birth in the United States of America than their white counterparts. And I will answer the question, and I would like to have a follow-up question for you, if that's okay, if we can work that way. So when it comes to the mortality rate, maternal mortality rate here, when you look into this, it's actually really interesting and really disheartening. The leading cause of death for mothers in the United States and pregnant women is actually homicide. And Black women are at the top of that list when it comes to maternal mortality rates. If you are a Black pregnant woman, you are actually 8.1 times more likely to be murdered than an unpregnant Black woman here in the United States. And that's often something that's not factored in these conversations that we have surrounding systemic racism. And this is why much of the speech that I talked about today focused on the idea of systemic racism and why this narrative can be harmful harmful because we look at disparities, whether they be in education, in the criminal justice system, and immediately if we see a difference between black and white, we go, well, it must be racism. Because of Jim Crow, because of slavery. And we label that racism is the problem, we set it aside, we give a slogan about it or a speech about it, and then the problem never is solved. And that is often the case with the black community in particular, why I refer to the narrative of systemic racism as a crutch. Now, I would like to ask you, because you presented the question, what do you think is happening in medical practices that would cause a maternal mortality rate among black women to be higher? Do you think that doctors are just actively discriminating against black women?
I believe that malpractice is happening.
So that they are just purposely allowing black women who are pregnant to die?
There's also in this country a problem with black people tend to not be able to obtain opioids as easily as their white counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
I work in a pharmacy. I have dealt with this in my line of work. Why can't everybody, race, gender, religion, why can't we all get the same medications?
It's interesting that we talk about like access to opioids, which is not something that I view as being particularly positive, and something that I would think would actually be a help to the black community to have less access to. But often when we're having these conversations surrounding the way that black people are affected, when you boil it down, it comes down to more of a class issue. And again, we make it about race and we scream that it is racism, and we ignore what could be a class issue, what could be an access issue, what could be an education issue. And in doing so, we are committing harm against the black community. And that's not to say that I think you are purposefully going out and committing harm against people, but I do think it can be a side effect of the conversations that we have when we go down this path. I do not think that obstetricians, who obviously is a profession that skews female, are actively discriminating against or ignoring black women when they come in with problems with their pregnancy. To think that the idea that the mortality rate among black women is solely because white doctors and white female doctors are simply standing there to watch black women who are pregnant die is not very convincing to me. And again, if we look into other factors, there are other factors that account for that.
So you believe it's just that they are murdered more than malpractice or anything else?
Well, if you have homicide, that is the leading cause of maternal mortality for all races, I might add. So that is the leading cause, but then you have black women at the top of that list above all other races, and we know that when black women, black men even, die to homicide, it is most likely the perpetrator is also going to be another black person. So if we are truly worried about the maternal mortality rate among black women in particular, your culprit is most likely going to be another black person. So I think that should be addressed. Now, if we address that and still the maternal mortality rate is higher among black women, I'm still not going to look into racism. I would look into resourcing the neighborhoods that these women are growing up in, because we know that black people tend to have a lower socioeconomic status, which means probably lower quality health care, and address that first. But again, racism is not at the top of my list.
Do you think that these lower class people staying together, do you think that is still, these areas are under redlining, have impact from redlining?
I think that very well could be possible, but a lot of people use redlining to say white people have actively discriminated against black people and sort of forced them into ghettos and forced them into Section 8 housing and projects, when you'll actually find that black people do the very same thing. So again, when we make an issue about racism because we see a disparity, we ignore the actual problems. Tom Sowell, who is a brilliant economist and is unfortunately in his 90s, which means he will not be with us for very much longer, wrote a book called Visions of the Anointed, where he talks about redlining and this whole narrative, because he grew up in the projects from a really young age and then would go on to be this brilliant economist. But he actually found, in looking at the demographics demographics of banks that were giving out these loans and giving out financial aids, that black banks discriminated against black people at an even higher rate than white banks discriminated against black people. And then he looked at Asian banks and he found that Asian banks discriminated against white people at an even higher rate than they discriminated against black people. So there's all these layers to something like redlining, but often you hear redlining and then you just think racist white people denied black people. And looking into the numbers, it's seemingly not the case.